Welcome everybody to the colloquium for Tuesday here. I'd like to introduce Sara Beery, our speaker. She's a final year PhD candidate in computing and mathematical sciences at CalTech, advised by Pietro Perona. She's a GRFP fellow, founder of the AI for Conservation Slack community, and the founding director of the CalTech Summer School on Computer Vision Methods for Ecology. So if everyone can welcome Sara, go for it.
Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, hi everyone. First, obviously, thanks for having me, and it's been really fun to be able to come to UW and talk to everyone. So in my talk today, I'm going to be talking about computer vision for global scale biodiversity monitoring, and really in this talk we'll be covering research. It's kind of everything from really developing novel computer vision methods to be able to solve problems that come up when we work in some of these different domains, all the way to actually deploying some of those methods in the field and building systems that that humans can interact with to improve the robustness of some of these automated methods. But maybe as a starting point, we can just look at what computer vision is. Traditionally, computer vision is a field that seeks to answer questions, extract information from raw images, from these matrices of pixels. So one very classic example is image classification. Which category or which class Y is in image X? And so, if you have some input image X, these days, the field of computer vision often will try to build a model that can go from those input pixels and estimate the probability of a given class Y given X. And it's important to note that these really are estimates of probabilities as opposed to true probabilities in most cases. And these models, they used to be very heuristic, built on handcrafted features, and these days are usually massively parameterized deep learning models, things like convolutional neural networks and transformers. And the models might output something like, for this image, it's 95% confident it's an elephant and 5% confident that it's a giraffe. But kind of why do we care? So for me, I care whether there's an elephant in the image because we're currently in a pretty catastrophic state in terms of biodiversity decline. We've seen drop-offs in wildlife species at faster rates now than we were seeing during the last extinction of the dinosaurs. And we've actually lost, according to World Wildlife Fund, around 68% of our animal populations on average since just 1970. And this matters for us as a human society because biodiversity is really intrinsically tied to things like climate change, public health, for example. As you see population sizes decrease for a given species, you're increasing then the susceptibility to disease for those species as the genetic pool gets smaller. And as you're reducing animal habitats, we see more human-wildlife conflict and more human-wildlife interaction, which then can cause disease vectors to jump from wildlife to humans, leading to things like global pandemics, which I'm sure we're all aware of how disruptive that can be. Beyond that, biodiversity is really tied to food security. For example, if we move to less diverse agriculture, we end up much more susceptible to disease and invasive pests. And biodiversity is tied to ecosystem services, the amount of carbon that we're actually capturing with plants as opposed to, releasing into the atmosphere. And, I'm not the only person who's interested in the ways that we can try to understand biodiversity and potentially mitigate the biodiversity loss that we're seeing. Biologists, zoologists, ecologists, earth scientists have been collecting biodiversity data for hundreds of years and using it to build data-centric models of what we're seeing. But with recent advances in sensor technology, and as hardware becomes cheaper and more accessible, we've really seen a massive explosion in the amount of data and the diversity of data globally that we have representing biodiversity. We work with everything from mobile sensors like satellites, low-flying aircraft, drones, and sensors placed directly on animals to track individuals over time and space. We also work with networks of static sensors, things like static motion-triggered camera traps that I work with quite a bit, or bioacoustic sensors that will give you a representation of a given space over long periods of time that are spatially sparse. as well as community science data, which is basically leveraging the power of passionate citizens around the world to actually capture images of plants and animals that they see and upload them into large-scale repositories like iNaturalist, which enables community members to contribute to scientific occurrence observations. But the problem with this massive explosion in data is that the traditional ecological paradigm relied very heavily on manual data processing. For example, if you're collecting a lot of images, traditionally an ecologist would place sensors in the wild, collect images, go get originally rolls of film, then later SD cards from those cameras, bring them back to their lab, go through the images and manually label each image to species, and then bring that in as inputs into ecological models like population models or species occurrence models. With the massive scale of data that we're now bringing in, that process just does not work anymore. For example, I put a network of camera traps out in Kenya in early 2020. And last year alone, just in 2021, that network of camera traps collected over 10 million images. There's just absolutely no way that myself and even with a team of undergrads would ever reasonably be able to process that data by hand. Community scientists have collected over 64 million species observations in iNaturalist, and a single aerial survey, for example, a low-flying aircraft survey, like the one they're currently undertaking in Kenya and Tanzania to build the largest population census of the elephant population that have been seen. One of those flights can generate over 200 terabytes of video. So I posit that we actually need computer vision to help automate this data processing, to be able to keep up and to be able to scale up to the entire taxonomic tree and the globe when we want to monitor what's going on Earth. But unfortunately, unlike a lot of the traditional data paradigms we might see in computer vision, things like ImageNet, which is based on images that people take and then upload to the internet, things like social media images, biodiversity data can be very noisy. For example, here we're looking at camera trap images, which don't have human intelligence in the loop, helping to capture the image and frame the objects of interest. That means that sometimes the animals that you might be interested in can be heavily occluded. For example, this giraffe that's hidden here behind a tree, or an elephant in the background here behind another tree. Data quality can be very poor. Weather, lighting conditions mean that sometimes you really have no idea what you're looking at all. And large amounts of the data, sometimes 70, 80% of the data collected in camera trap networks can be empty. If you're a wildlife ecologist and you're looking at images triggered, false motion triggers from waving grass in the wind, this is incredibly time consuming, and that data for you actually doesn't contain anything of value. But I actually see this as another opportunity, because what this means is that in all of that empty data, we actually get these amazing longitudinal pictures of microhabitats and how they're changing with environmental covariates. If only we can figure out something like a self-supervised or unsupervised approach to extract that scientific information. Biodiversity data also has a long tail. If you look at just the first 16 million species observations that were uploaded to iNaturalist, and if you use the rough rule of thumb that you need around 100 examples of a species for a modern state-of-the-art machine learning model to be able to recognize it accurately, what you can see is that in those first 16 million images, we had over 10,000 species that had enough data. We could recognize close to 10,000 species accurately. But there's another order of magnitude more species that fall below that, that in this long tail regime. And sometimes those species are the ones that are of most scientific interest. For example, species that are endangered or at risk. And so what we can see here is that if you really want to capture all of biodiversity, not just the common species, you really can't ignore that few-shot learning problem. And finally, and maybe most insidiously, biodiversity data is just not IID. It's not independently and identically distributed. So, for one example, if you think about where species are on Earth, that's constantly changing. Species have global scale migration patterns that are strongly correlated with a position and a time. And then not only that, as climate is changing, we're seeing that those species distributions are also changing. So if you could capture, which we can't currently, if you could capture a perfect data set that represented all the species on Earth and where they occur today, that's not going to help you this time next year, because a lot of those species ranges and their populations are changing very quickly in response to climate change. And then, not only that, but the data that we have access to is also spatiotemporally biased. And what we see here, if you look at this map of global biodiversity, this is an estimate of alpha diversity, the number of unique species in any given position. What you can see is that most of the biodiversity on Earth is in the subequatorial tropics. But if you look at the species occurrence data that's available in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is the largest scale repository of biodiversity data on Earth, and billions of records, you see a strong bias towards wealthy countries. It's actually maybe better correlated with GDP than where biodiversity actually is. So in order to try to tackle some of these challenges throughout my PhD, I've looked at a couple different approaches. First, trying to measure and overcome that domain shift that we're seeing, where distributions in any given space are not representative of distributions globally. We've also looked at learning from imperfect data, trying to handle some of the data challenges that we're seeing. And finally, I've looked at deploying systems, machine learning systems, even that are imperfect in the wild, and building efficient collaborations between human and AI that enable us to get scalable and accurate results from machine learning models, even if those models are not perfect. So first, looking at measuring and overcoming domain shift, we'll mostly be looking at one type of ecological data, these static cameras or camera traps. And so what we're looking at here is 22 million camera trap records in Wildlife Insights, which is a global scale data management platform for camera trap data that's a collaboration between around 20 different NGOs and Google Research. And one of the things that's really interesting about static cameras that really exemplifies this domain shift challenge is that not only do you have this kind of macro scale distribution of species you might see in given countries and at different times of year, but actually each individual sensor is representative of a microhabitat. And the distribution that you see for a single sensor is not necessarily representative or even strongly correlated with the underlying species distribution in an area. So for example, I have one camera trap in the Los Angeles area that is just placed very close to a bobcat den. 90% of the images of that camera are bobcats, but bobcats are actually incredibly rare in a city like Los Angeles. So you have to be able to handle this distribution shift on a per sensor basis as opposed to a per region basis. And then not only that, you have this fixed background. So what that means is that if you're not careful, you can actually very strongly overfit to a visual shift. Connections like you frequently see a certain species at one specific camera trap, it's hard to learn to disambiguate the species from that specific background. And an example of how this might sort of be exacerbated is that because the animals themselves are habitual, the data can be very repetitive, which leads to sample inefficiency. So these images were actually taken a month apart, but obviously they're very similar. And from a machine learning perspective, you can totally see how if you saw one of those images during training, it wouldn't be so hard to accurately predict the other during test time. But this means if you're not very careful about the way that you split your data, you can kind of get a false sense of security, a false sense of accuracy that's not representative of your model itself, but more representative of how well you can memorize a very specific static sensor network. We explored this in some early work in my PhD and found that if you take a more rigorous approach to the way that you split your data for training and evaluation, instead of splitting based on time, you actually split based on sensor locations. Not, some of these are in LA and the others are in Seattle. Here we're taking a distributed network of sensors around the Southwest and randomly sampling sensors for train and test, which is much more representative of potentially a real world use case by an ecologist who's interested in those same species, but wants to be able to go out and place a new sensor and expect these models to still work well. Here we're denoting cis and trans as kind of stealing these from chemistry, where cis is same and trans is different. So cis are the cameras that were seen during training, data that's held out in time for evaluation, and trans are cameras that were never seen during training. And what you can see is if you plot the error versus the number of training examples, and you take a best fit line through all of the species of interest, there is a consistent jump in error when you're moving from cameras that were seen during training to cameras that were not. And what we found actually is this type of performance gap based on real world distribution shifts is actually incredibly ubiquitous in real world scenarios. When you move beyond these heavily curated fixed data sets like iNaturalist or like ImageNet, like COCO, what we find is that deploying models in the real world means you need to handle distribution shift, and that the benchmarks in the computer vision and machine learning community weren't representative. And so what we were finding is people were developing methods that seemed to work well, shifting from, let's say, images of technology in eBay to images of technology in Amazon. But when you're going from, some static sensors to another, or one hospital to another hospital, a country to another country, what we found is this performance was seeing significant degradation. And so I worked with an amazing team of researchers led by Peng Wei and Shiori at Stanford to build up this large-scale benchmark of representative in the wild distribution shifts. And then just this year, we extended that to include a bunch of unsupervised data for some of these domains. And I think the most interesting thing that we found is that if you look at the leaderboards for the wilds data set, most of the really fancy, incredibly complex, state-of-the-art methods for distribution shift don't do better than just ERM, just empirical risk minimization, when you're actually working on some of these real-world distribution shifts. And I think this means that we've been trying to tackle easier versions of the problem than what we see in the real world. But so how do we close this gap for static sensors? What can we do given the fact that we know that there's this correlation over time, that we know that the sensor itself is static? How do we capture the structure of that domain and take advantage of it? Well, one interesting thing that we found in terms of this trade-off between generalization and maybe the granularity of the problem was that since we had developed this really systematic, rigorous evaluation framework, we were able to walk our way up the taxonomic tree. And we found that just predicting the locations of animals, doing animal detection, generalized astonishingly well versus actually doing species categorization. And I think what this means to me, though this is something we definitely could explore more rigorously, is that somehow when you trade off between robustness to generalization and granularity, you often can actually get systems that will work off the shelf, will work at scale, as long as you make the problem sufficiently general. So finding animals in camera traps, we found experimentally, was a sufficiently general version of this problem for an off-the-shelf computer vision detection model to be able to do this even in regions, ecosystems, and for species that had never been seen during training. But once you walk down the taxonomic tree to the genus or species level, that was no longer the case. Those shifts in subpopulation distribution were far too challenging. But this is important because if you evaluate robustly, you can figure out what is possible to impactfully deploy. And so because we had this framework, we found that we could generalize animal, human, and vehicle detection really robustly to new cameras. We knew that already could be incredibly impactful because 70–80% of the images are empty. So if you can just filter out those empty images and you can help direct the attention of researchers, spend their time labeling the data that they're actually interested in, you can really see a pretty significant impact. I worked with Microsoft AI for Earth to deploy this model. We built an open source API and integrated it into commonly used camera trap ecological data processing tools like time-lapse. And now this model is being used to process data for over 50 NGOs and conservation organizations worldwide. We processed 100 million images last year alone. A couple examples of the ways this model is being used. It's used by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game for the 2,000 camera traps they use for wolf population management. And there they collect around 11 million images a season. And using our model, now they have to review less than 15% of those with humans, which means that for the first time in the history of this program, they're actually able to review the data the same year they collect it, which means that when they're making science policy decisions for years in the future, it's based on data that's close to real time, as opposed to previously, sometimes data that was 5 or even 7 years out of date. So if you are able to actually build things that are robust and trustworthy, they can be used, even if they're not perfect, even if they're not answering the question that we initially sought out to answer all the way, which is identify species and perfectly automate data processing for camera traps. You can build really impactful machine learning systems as long as they're robust. Another example is Wildlife Protection Solutions is an NGO that connects camera traps to the edge. And they send model images directly from the edge to the cloud and run them through our models to detect in real time wildlife threats from poaching or sometimes just human-wildlife conflict. And they estimate that they detect around 1 real wildlife threat per week using our models. And that's somehow it's not quite handling the out of distribution problem. What we did is we sidestepped it. We figured out what did generalize out of distribution. We simplified the problem to animal, human, and field detection. But one of the things that humans are really good at is that generalization, is learning to recognize things in new contexts. And so we took an active learning approach to figure out how do we actually get very efficiently to a system that will do species identification out of distribution for a new network of camera traps. And we leverage the knowledge we have about the domain structure and that robust model we have for detecting animals. So first we detect animals in each, for a given camera trap, we detect all of the potential animal images over an entire season. Then we cluster those based on visual similarity for each new camera. And then we have humans ID the clusters. And the active learning criteria is heavily leveraging the fact that there is this visual similarity over time for a given static camera. And we're able to get the same accuracy with 99.5% fewer labels. So we were able to label around 12 million images with just a few thousand, manually labeled images. Now, ideally, we'd like to see this process get even more efficient, but it's quite cool to see how we can bring human intelligence, the skills that humans have in generalization, to bear along with some of these automated approaches to get to a reasonable answer quickly. So next I'll be looking at how do we learn from imperfect data? For example, how do you learn to recognize the endangered grevy zebra, their hair hidden in the fog in this image? So the first way that data can be imperfect is we can just have species that don't have a lot of training examples, right? Here, what we're showing is that for rare classes, it's just hard. It doesn't matter if you're in distribution or out of distribution. Rare species are just hard. One of the things that we've looked at to try to improve performance on these rare classes is using a combination of like graphics-based synthetic data plus generative or adversarial networks that are used to increase the realism of that graphics-based data. And here we found the most effective thing was not pixel-to-pixel GANs, but actually GANs that were just learning to mimic low-level image statistics for a given set of test cameras. And we found that we could get improvements on rare classes by up to 70%. Now the bottleneck is to do this effectively, we need 3D articulated models for every species we're interested in. But actually there's been some recent work, Michael Black's group or Angju Kanazawa's, in really efficiently generating some of these articulated 3D models from just a few image examples. And so potentially we could combine these approaches and see really scalable rare class generalization. Now, how does an expert label something like this? So this was something when I first started working with ecologists, I just kind of didn't believe them. I would get images that were incredibly challenging, things like this where it's just really foggy, and they would have given it a confident identification at a species level. So you just look at one potential object, it's really unclear from just this image whether this is foreground or background. It could be a tree, it could be an animal. But what we found is that human experts weren't labeling images in a vacuum. They were looking over in very long time horizons, looking at all of the other images taken from that same camera location. And they would look look at that and incorporate what they were seeing in order to identify difficult images. Up to a month of data at a time, and they would be looking at what species are showing up at that camera. What size and shape are those species within this specific field of view? What times of day are they showing up? Are they in herds? Are they alone? And they would use all of that temporal context to ID some very challenging objects, things like this, so they confidently identified this as a wildebeest. Now, once they talked me through the process, I understood, but I also understood that meant we were really shooting ourselves in the foot when we were giving our machine learning models just single images to look at instead of incorporating that temporal context. And not just sort of the traditional temporal aggregation where you look at just very short time horizons, right? Where you look at just a few images at a time. Because here, within a window of even hours, all of the images are foggy. So there's a lot less information than what you can capture if you're actually able to extend that temporal horizon and look over a month of data at a time. So, humans are using that temporal context both to improve their object classification on a per location basis. So if you have one image and another that are very visually similar, they're highly likely to be the same species for a given camera trap. And also, it helps them reduce the impact of some of these false positives. So if you're at a completely new camera, sometimes in certain lighting conditions, a rock or a bush can look something like an animal, but it's very easy for us to quickly understand that looking at multiple images at a time, oh, in fact, that's just a rock. So what we tried to do is we tried to build that type of temporal context into an object detection model. And we did this using sort of a two-pass approach. So in the first pass through the data on new cameras not seen during training, we would extract what we called contextual memory. We would take an object-centric approach. So for each image seen by a camera, we would look at just the objects detected by something like the mega detector. And then we would extract features from the crops within those objects and reduce the feature size. So, spatially pool them, so you just have a vector. And then we would maintain spatiotemporal information for each object. So the location of the box in the image and the date and time both got encoded, kind of similar to the way that you encode location in a sentence for a natural language processing model. And then we took a curational approach. So we didn't take every object from every image. Instead, we just took the highest confidence objects from each image. And then we used an attention-based approach to incorporate that context between the first and second stage of a two-stage object detection model. So the way these models work is you have an input image. In the first stage, you predict potential objects, sometimes up to 300 possible objects in a given image. And then in a traditional method, then it goes straight to the second stage, where for each of those objects, you try to predict which category it is or whether it's potentially background. Now, what we did is for each of those objects coming in, we incorporated that temporal context, that long-term temporal context for each individual object before you needed to actually make the categorization. So the way that works is pretty straightforward attention block. So this is something that that's pretty commonly used in something like a transformer, where you're essentially saying for a given input object, for the features in a given input object, and for all of these contextual features, we project them into some shared space with a learned, like a parameterized set of projections where they can be visually compared. And then based on that comparison and how those are sort of ranked based on, just simple cosine similarity, we take a softmax and use that as a weight that then we use to aggregate those context features after they've been projected into a new space. So now you have essentially this weighted sum over the potential context features that you're seeing over a month of data. And then you incorporate that into the output features. And then at that point, now you make your prediction about category. So you have, instead of just these single image features, you have image features that have this context awareness. And then we also use the similar approach to add additional short-term attention. So basically, the intuition there is that within a very short time horizon, potentially that information is even more informative. And now we can, in order to fit this reasonably into memory, we actually can look at all of the potential predicted objects for each image, as opposed to this just curated subset that are put into that long-term memory bank. we tried our approach on a few different data sets, 2 different camera trap data sets. So Snapshot Serengeti, which is from East Africa, from Tanzania. CalTech camera traps, which is a data set that I published early in my PhD with camera trap data from across the American Southwest. And CityCam, which is a static traffic camera data set, because there's actually nothing about this method that's designed for ecology, right? It's just a way of incorporating long-term temporal information for a static sensor. And what we found is that we saw pretty significant improvements over single frame models, and even significant improvements over video-based models. Going from single frame to our context-based model, we saw mean average precisions go up by 17, 19%. And if you look, qualitatively, what we find is that attention is temporally adaptive to relevance. So in the first example here, you're seeing a warthog that uses the same game trail over a month at a time. And it's going back and forth on that same game trail. And here are the attention weights, which are these green numbers paid to each of these objects in these examples. The highest weighted examples are, that warthog using that game trail over long periods of time. In the second example, you have a Thompson's gazelle that's grazing in front of the camera. And here, most of the attention was actually just paid to different images from that exact same detection event. But somehow, because we didn't build a handcrafted heuristic, it could be quite flexible to this temporal relevance. And we did find that we were able to correctly label objects in very challenging images. And here you can see that the attention is being paid to other examples of wildebeest in clear days as well as foggy ones in order to make that wildebeest detection. Like overall, intuitively, as we'd expect, this is helping with the hard stuff. It's helping with objects that are moving out of frame, that are highly occluded, that are far from the camera, poorly lit, and it also helps reduce the impact of those background distractors, of these things that are in these test-only cameras that potentially can cause repeated false positives if they're just similar enough to an object of interest in different lighting conditions. We're currently incorporating this model within Wildlife Insights and seeing some reasonably promising results, even when we're expanding the scope of the number of classes we're considering from something like 40 to 1,000. And I think one of the fun things I wanted to point out is that Wildlife Insights is actually already kind of starting to be used across the Pacific Northwest. So here's one example, the Cascades Wolverine Project that's processed close to 100,000 images from just up here in the North Cascades. Okay, so I'll finish by talking about some of the ways that we've deployed these systems, human AI systems in the wild. So first, one example of this is something that I worked with an undergraduate at CalTech to build. We call it Elephant Book. And it's essentially a human AI system for individual elephant re-identification. And I think the interesting thing about this project is we wanted to see what we could do with computer vision, starting with no training data. So basically, we knew that we wanted to monitor this elephant population, which is 2,500 to 3,000 individuals across the transnational boundary between Kenya and Tanzania in southern Kenya. And we didn't have individual identities, but we did have an attribute-based system that was designed by ecologists in South Africa, where humans would code each individual elephant based on visual attributes in the shape of the contours of the ears, presence or absence of tusks, and different sort of characteristic features. And so starting out a couple of years ago, this undergrad I was working with worked with Allen AI Institute to integrate within Earth Ranger this ability to take elephant sightings from Earth Ranger and then port them directly into our system and build a user interface that enabled local rangers to be able to code these elephant sightings. So we built out the technology first and the data pipeline first, and then started collecting data using our pipeline, which allowed us to get this standardized, reasonably robust, human verified identities of individuals, as well as boxes corresponding to those specific individuals over multiple images, and then starting to build that up over time. And it took about a month or two of deployment before we started to get enough data to be able to start training and evaluating computer vision methods on this system. But then what we found is that, as the number of individuals in the database was growing, and it became harder and harder for humans to start sorting through all of that data, we were able to actually start bringing in basically wavelet-based contour matching of ear contours, something that's been called curve rank, was developed at RPI. And that was able to start increasing the match accuracy for these images. So now we have a system that's a combination of these attribute labels as well as these contour-based approaches. And now we're exploring more metric learning-based approaches that are measuring things like facial wrinkles. And these combined systems mean that they've actually, the ecologists in the Mara have been able to track the same population before they had any automation, and have been able to reduce the human effort as they scale up their ability to monitor this population. I've had this now deployed for over a year in Kenya, and one of the most rewarding things is that it means that we're directly collaborating with local Kenyan scientists. And the coolest part is seeing both the people that we're collaborating with and the rangers that are on the ground actually learning how to better identify individual elephants, which is then informing the techniques that we develop on the computer vision side. So using that domain expertise to actually inform the methods we build, and vice versa. Second, we've been looking at automating escapement estimation in sonar for sustainable fisheries. So this is an example of a deployed set of sonar cameras on the Kenai River. And here, these are used by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, as well as there are some on the Elwha River in Washington and the Eel in Northern California. And these sonar systems are used to try to count how many salmon are escaping upstream, so upstream minus downstream fish, so that you can start to estimate the size of the salmon population in 3 years after they've spawned, gone out into the ocean, and then come back. And currently, these are all processed manually. So teams of ecologists will go out and live in a tent for 3 months, for example, on the Nushagak, and take 4-hour shifts looking at these cameras, and with 2 clickers, an upstream clicker and a downstream clicker. And every 4 hours, they radio in the counts to the central Alaska Department of Fish and Game office, and then they make near real-time decisions over whether to open and close the Bristol Bay commercial fishing industry and the Kenai commercial fishing industry, which are multi-billion-dollar industries. And because of the amount of human effort it takes to monitor just one estuary of one river, this is incredibly sparse spatially. And so what we're looking at is how do we automate these counts, particularly in ways that generalize over time as the bathymetry of the bottom changes, as the river level goes up and down, and also as the sensors are moved. And it's actually a really interesting version of a multi-object tracking problem in computer vision, where we've removed visual re-identifiability, because there's not anything very specifically visually re-identifiable in these wiggly blobs. And most of the multi-object tracking benchmarks that we see in computer vision, it's actually been found that you can do reasonably well just by detecting the objects across all the frames and then doing visual-based matching, as opposed to using any motion-based information at all. But this is a scenario where the motion-based information is almost all of the signal. And this actually comes up quite a bit in ecology. We have a similar example, and we're actually trying similar methods for a project working with entomologists at CalTech that are tracking ant behavior at the nest of ant nests, the mouths of ant nests. The other interesting thing about this system is it's an example of where things need to move to the edge, because we do not have the bandwidth to send this data to the cloud from the Nushagak to be able to actually make these real-time decisions. So we're currently investigating how do we actually keep this robust, how do we keep that human verification in the loop, given a system that does a lot of edge-based processing. Finally, we're really interested in how do we efficiently answer new ecological questions. Somehow there's not enough scale of people like me who have the skill set to come in and build out the problem formulation, the training data set, everything that's needed to figure out whether off-the-shelf methods work and then develop new methods when they don't work. And so what we want to do is we want to make it very easy for ecologists to interact with these massive repositories of media data. For example, the 64 million images in iNaturalist. And so what we did is we looked at trying to understand universal representations for this natural world space. You know, very different from the types of images and even the types of fine-grained categories that you get in iNaturalist from something like ImageNet. And then how do you take those representations and efficiently adapt them to new ecologically relevant tasks, going beyond species ID to behavior, health, age, context. And you know, ideally, we would end up with systems where an ecologist could really easily query one of these massive repositories and find examples of, for example, here, alligator lizards mating, that aren't just based on visual similarity, but are actually able to handle the diversity of what's seen. Because currently what we find is that self-supervised methods will find you the stuff that looks the most similar, and it's almost never the same species doing the same thing. It might just be lizards on the pavement. My large goal is, you know, how do we monitor biodiversity and detect changes in biodiversity rapidly across the taxonomic tree, globally and in close to real time? And as I move forward into a faculty position, some of the things that I'm really interested in, first, I think we need to make much better use of all of the available multimodal data. You know, everything I talked about so far was pretty much looking at one type of data at a time, just camera traps, just sonar, just, you know, rangered captured elephant images. But these different types of modalities are actually complementary, and no individual type of data is actually able to capture the whole taxonomic tree or able to capture, you know, the same spatial and temporal scale that we might want. And so as a first step down this direction, we've been looking at multi-view, multimodal urban forest monitoring under domain shift. So how do we build a system that can find and categorize all of the trees in cities using a combination of aerial data and Google Street View data, as well as potentially community science data like iNaturalist? And how do we use that effectively to get better generalization to cities that were never seen during training? How do we use, for example, cross-view agreement or cross-view supervision with this geometrically aware understanding of the shared space of where trees are over space and time to get better representations for new cities? And then how do you think about fine-tuning those representations for a given city under the fact that the distribution of species is very imbalanced and potentially the representations are not actually separable? So how do you use humans to do targeted ground truthing to enable you to evaluate or fine-tune your models in new cities? And, you know, we're hoping to incorporate this within the Environmental Insights Explorer, which is currently doing reasonably good tree canopy prediction in Los Angeles and scaling up to multiple cities. And this is a project I'm doing with Google Research. I'm next really interested in the ways that we can incorporate domain expertise, domain knowledge into our methods. That context-based model was an example of this. We wouldn't have thought of tackling the problem in that way if we hadn't had this direct connection to the stakeholders and learned what insight they were using to handle these challenging problems. One additional example of this is we're currently looking with the data we've been collecting with Elephant Book and trying to improve our re-identification accuracy by taking the co-sightings of elephants, building a graph representing the hierarchical social network of the elephant population, and then building that into a social prior on re-identification in groups of elephants at a time. And finally, I think it's very important that the technology we develop is equitable. And, you know, to me, that means a lot of different things, but the first thing is that I believe that when we're developing equity, when we're developing technology with a stakeholder in mind, it should be developed with direct collaboration and attribution for their effort. And we really want to push back against things like parachute science, where people from wealthy institutions go to the developing world, collect data, take it back to their wealthy institution, write a paper about it, and then walk away. I think it's very important that, and we actually have an obligation to really rigorously evaluate our methods as they're intended to be used and build methods that are actually solving the problems that we claim they're solving in the introduction of our papers. And as part of that, I think we need to increase access to knowledge and tools, because we need capacity on the ground globally and across fields to be able to really effectively and in trustworthy ways scale up our ability to automate this data processing and keep up with the amount of data that's coming in. And part of that means that I actually think it's a call to arms for more efficient, less computationally expensive, edge-based computer vision and machine learning. Because currently that network of camera traps that I have in Africa, the only way for me to get machine learning results for that data from our cloud-based models is to ship hard drives from Kenya to California, upload those hard drives into the cloud from California, process the results in the cloud, and then basically translate those results back to the conservation land managers. And that means that the latency is incredibly high. And so, you know, in cases like the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, where they're looking at near real-time salmon escapement estimation, it just doesn't fly. You need to be able to do these things at the edge. And we shouldn't be seeing models that are only usable by people with incredible access to computational power and data storage. We want these methods to be usable at scale. And this means we need to build things, we need to optimize for efficiency as opposed to tiny improvements in accuracy. And along the lines of trying to increase capacity, to try to take like a different approach to tackling things quickly, I designed this summer school on computer vision methods for ecology, where it's designed to be, it's targeted to ecology graduate students and postdocs who have their own data, their own research question that they want to tackle with computer vision approaches. And they actually applied with the data in hand and with a research proposal. We got a really amazing set of applicants, and it was very hard, but we got it down to 20 accepted people in the cohort. And they're working now with a mentor to make sure that their data set is ready for machine learning prototyping. And then they'll come to CalTech for 3 weeks in August and be actually themselves training and potentially even deploying these models on their data. And here it's like we're trying to really empower people in other communities to take ownership of the application of machine learning in their field with all of their context of what the risks are of failure and what the potential failure modes might be. And then they can meet us in the middle. And when they say, look, the off-the-shelf method is able to do deer, but it's terrible at bobcats, then my computer vision graduate students can be directly tackling methodology improvements that'll try to improve on some of the things that state-of-the-art methods don't work for. And here's just a few examples of the really cool stuff that the applicants are bringing to the summer school. Stuff like identifying permafrost thaw slumps using satellite images, studying changing physical and chemical sea conditions and how they impact phytoplankton physiology, and predicting wind speed from videos of swaying trees. There's a lot of really interesting new questions from a vision perspective that are coming up by trying to actually close the gap between these two fields. Cool, thanks. So happy to answer questions, and yeah.
That was me remote clapping. Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. We have some questions in the chat. If anyone else has questions, please drop them in the chat. I have my question, which I will push to the side in favor of better ones, starting with Stefania. So what's the most promising approach, or what are some of the most promising approaches you've seen for equitable computer vision ML research collaborations in remote locations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I think one of the first things you have to discover is basically like, what is the capacity? Like, is there any way that you can build cloud-based systems? And if you can't, that's fine. But then often, like, our first approach is getting a donation of local GPUs, so that, you know, if we are designing computer vision methods that require GPUs for running inference at scale, that we're actually helping those community members get access to the computational power they need locally. The interesting question there becomes, if you're doing all your processing locally, there's still potentially a lot of value in the data that you're collecting and processing for others, and also potentially value in the data others are collecting for you. So how do you sort of de-silo the data, given the fact that bandwidth is limited. And there, I think there's potentially some really cool work that we could do looking at anomaly detection, like trying to decide what images should we spend the bandwidth to send to the cloud to basically improve our base models. And then how do you actually push those base models back to the edge? How do you kind of share that information beyond just a single research group and then give it back to them in a way that's effective? But one of the things we run into with Wildlife Insights is sometimes we do something like add the continent of Australia, which is a bunch of new species that weren't ever seen before in training. And mostly that's fine, except for weirdly, performance will drop on specific species in Israel. And so when you're in these shifting systems where the question, the bar is changing all the time, where the species you might try to consider in like, you know, this large scale classification model are changing and shifting, you need to have really robust validation that can handle that moving bar. And I think that that's one of the things that a fixed benchmark data set can never really give us in the same way. And so I think there's a lot of need for us to think about ways to build evaluation methods for machine learning models that are representative of the changing world, as opposed to like single fixed benchmarks.
Great. So going in order, we have Dan up next. Are there efforts or is there potential for attributes other than species? I'm going down into age, sex, health, etc.
Yeah, there's a ton of potential. There's not enough labeled data. And this is, I think, one of the reasons we were trying to get into that like efficient adaptation space, because essentially we give a species ID model to an ecologist and they'd be like, amazing, how old are they? And you're like, well, you didn't tell me how old they were in the first place. So we don't have the information to do that effectively. But hopefully you could build potentially representations that adapt quickly to limited fine-tuning data sets, like limited training data sets. So in that efficient adaptation paper, we were looking at just 50 positive and 50 negative training examples for each task and evaluating how quickly we could adapt these universal representations to those new topics.
Great. So Sham asks, kind of an STS question, can't these camera technologies be exploited by poachers as well?
Yes. I wrote a workshop paper last year about some of the limitations of the current ways that people think about data privacy for at-risk species. So a pretty common thing in the camera trap world is that people will release the imagery publicly, but they'll jitter the GPS location. And I worked with Elizabeth Bondi, who's another graduate student, and we basically showed that using really simple methods that just took like NDVI and changes in kind of like the heights or the topology of like within a kilometer, plus being able to figure out based on the way shadows are changing where you are roughly in the world and what direction you're pointing, you can really limit your search space. So I think there's some pretty interesting work that could be done in trying to figure out how we can actually remove the localizable features from camera trap images so that you can still enable ecologists to share data and to be able to understand like the behavior of some of these endangered species without actually publishing data that puts those species at poaching risk.
Great. All right. So Magda asks, kind of a generalization question. Do you have any thoughts on the complementary idea of developing more general purpose tools that would enable different scientists to answer different questions, e.g. species identification as done here for one scientist, but the tool is also being applied, for instance, for how dry grass is over time for a different scientist?
Yeah. So I think I think there's a huge amount of need for that. And somehow I think right now, a lot of automated approaches are really limited by like specific, training and test sets. Like somehow maybe the architecture is something that could be shared. But what really makes these things work is this effective data science, this good curation of the right, like diverse training set to tackle these new questions. And I think there's been a lot of really awesome work kind of in the HCI space or maybe the human AI collaboration space in trying to make it easier for non-machine learning experts to build up iteratively training data sets for new questions. And then, those can be trained on general architectures. As far as general tools go, I'm a little bit in the other camp in that I feel a bit like in computer science, we've chased generality too far, and it's led us away from usable systems in a way. Like we want to see in computer vision papers, we want to see a change in a computer vision architecture, and then we want to see that it shows improvements on 20 different data sets in 20 different domains. But usually the trade-off is that those improvements are very small. And when you're talking about actually deploying these things in the field, the improvements almost never generalize. So what I would actually like to see is more work that's happening somewhere between like fully general methods and fully specific methods. Understanding what are some of these mid-level questions and what are ways that we can capture the structure of specific data to really get improvements that are significant, as opposed to like a 1% improvement. Because in the end, 1% improvement doesn't really change much in terms of the outcomes of that model.
Okay, great. And I'm gonna pick Tim's question and get as many voices as we can. Similar to Dan's questions, are there efforts and/or potential for capturing modeling learning from the interactions between species rather than just species identification? For example, complex interactions or emergent behaviors, swarm, mobility, changes in hierarchy, those kind of things.
So particularly in the video space, I think we're starting to see a lot more exploration of behavior and specifically behavior. I mean, behavior interactions across species sounds really interesting to me. We've looked a little bit at trying to identify the prey that carnivores are carrying in their mouths. So that's like just the starting point along that line. But from video data, we're starting to see a lot more studies of trying to automate behavior identification, and specifically automate behavior identification across taxa. And I'm actually working with a postdoc at Berkeley and then some researchers at KAUST to try to build a cross taxonomic scale video behavior data set for animals, as opposed to behavior data sets for humans. I think there's a ton of room for growth. I think we're really just scratching the surface of what's possible there.
Cool, and this will be the last one. We're kind of at time. Stephanie asks, how does your work build on the research and collaborations that exist in citizen science? What are the most common resistant responses, questions citizen scientists have to applications of AI/ML in this space, and how do you plan to address them?
Yeah, so I mean, I rely very heavily on citizen science to be able to label the training and test data sets that we use for machine learning. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of potential, and one of the things I'm really excited about with the University of Washington is the immense amount of experience that Allen School has in HCI, specifically for this reason, because somehow we've found qualitatively that there's different ways that we can incorporate machine learning in that citizen science process of trying to label these large-scale data sets. And I really think, in the future, what I want to see is citizen scientists used as like coming in and doing large-scale quality control and verification, and helping basically bridge these out of distribution gaps, but trying to let those citizen scientists be very efficient, because I think we're starting to be much better at some of these really basic tasks, like filtering out empty images, and we could really save people a lot of time, for example, in something like Zooniverse, if we start incorporating machine learning into that process. But we still rely on humans for their ability to robustly generalize, to figure things out of distribution, and potentially to catch the errors that machine learning models are making before they translate all the way to science policy and cause potential catastrophic risks.
Cool. Okay, well, we're slightly over time. Thank you so much for the discussion. Yeah, thank you again.
Cool.
So thanks everyone for being in the audience, and the recording will be up and all that.